It was a cold and foggy night. Officer Ray was on patrol in the quiet streets when he saw a masked man running out of a jewelry store. The man held a bag stuffed with stolen goods. Without wasting a second, Ray shouted, "Stop right there," and started chasing him. The robber glanced back, his eyes wild with fear, and ran even faster. He turned into a narrow, dark alley. Ray followed, his heavy boots echoing against the brick walls. The fog grew thicker, making it hard to see. Ray kept his flashlight pointed ahead, its dim beam barely cutting through the mist. At the end of the alley, the robber climbed over a broken fence and disappeared. Ray stopped for a moment to catch his breath. The place beyond the fence was no ordinary location, it was the town's old graveyard. Nobody dared to enter it, especially at night. People said it was cursed, haunted by restless spirits. But Ray couldn't let the thief escape. He climbed the fence and dropped into the graveyard. As soon as his feet hit the ground, an unsettling feeling washed over him. The air was colder here, heavy and thick. The graves were ancient, their stones cracked and covered in moss. Some were open, as if something had pushed its way out. Ray spotted the robber's shadow slipping behind a row of tombstones. He moved forward cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The silence was eerie, no wind, no sound, not even the chirp of a cricket. Suddenly, Ray heard something, a faint whisper. It was soft, almost like a sigh, but it was there. He froze and turned his flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, just graves and fog. Ray whispered to himself, "Stay calm." But deep down, he felt like he wasn't alone anymore. Something was watching. Ahead, the robber stumbled and disappeared behind a large tombstone. Ray gripped his flashlight tightly and approached, unaware that stepping into this graveyard was only the beginning of a nightmare. As Officer Ray moved deeper into the graveyard, an unsettling silence surrounded him. Even his own footsteps felt muffled, as if the ground beneath him wanted to swallow all sound. He gripped his flashlight tighter, scanning the tombstones, trying to catch a glimpse of the robber. Suddenly, a dry, crunching sound came from behind him. Ray spun around, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice barely steady. But there was no answer, only the fog swirling eerily in the cold air. He turned back, determined to catch the robber. His beam of light swept over a crumbling statue of an angel with hollow eyes. For a moment, Ray thought he saw its head move, just slightly. He shook his head. "Focus," he muttered to himself. Ahead, he spotted the robber crouched behind a large, mossy tombstone. His breath caught in his throat. "Got you now," he whispered, moving closer. But as he stepped forward, a cold wind suddenly rushed past him, chilling him to the bone. The air became heavy, making it hard to breathe. A faint laugh, high-pitched and echoing, rose from the shadows. It wasn't the robber. Ray froze, his eyes darting around. The laugh grew louder, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. He shouted, "Who's there?" Again, no response, just the laugh fading into whispers. The robber turned to look at Ray, his face pale and filled with terror. "It's not me," he stammered, backing away. Before Ray could ask what he meant, the ground beneath his feet trembled. A dark shadow passed between them, too quick to see clearly. The temperature dropped even further, and Ray felt his breath turn to mist. The robber's voice quivered. "We shouldn't be here," he whispered. Ray tried to reply, but his throat felt dry. His flashlight flickered, plunging them into momentary darkness. When the light came back, there was something standing between them, a tall, thin figure with hollow eyes that seemed to stare straight through them. Ray felt his blood run cold. This was no ordinary graveyard. Something was awake. Something that didn't want them there. The tall, shadowy figure stood motionless between Ray and the robber. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers. Its long, bony fingers twitched as it raised one hand, pointing directly at the robber. "You disturb the dead," it hissed, its voice low and sharp, like the rustling of dry leaves. The robber stumbled backward, his face pale and drenched in sweat. I didn't mean to. I was just trying to hide," he cried, his voice breaking. Ray tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, as if rooted to the ground. He gripped his flashlight tightly, but the beam seemed weaker, barely illuminating the figure before him. The shadow turned its head slowly toward Ray, its hollow gaze locking onto him. "And you brought him here," it whispered, its tone accusing. Ray's breath hitched. I was just doing my duty," he managed to say, though his voice trembled. Suddenly, a chilling wind swept through the graveyard. The tombstones groaned as if shifting under unseen pressure, and faint whispers filled the air. They were all around, surrounding Ray and the robber. The whispers were unintelligible, but they were angry, mournful, and growing louder with each passing second. The ground beneath Ray's feet began to tremble, and cracks appeared in the dirt. The robber screamed, pointing at the graves. "Look! They're waking up!" Ray's eyes widened as he saw skeletal hands clawing their way out of the ground, breaking through the earth-like grotesque plants sprouting from the soil. The shadows around them grew darker, and the figure stepped closer, its presence radiating cold. "Leave," it hissed, but its voice carried no mercy. "Leave, or stay forever." The robber grabbed Ray's arm, his nails digging in. "We need to run," he yelled, panic overtaking him. Ray wanted to move, but fear paralyzed him. The skeletal hands were now pulling themselves free, their hollow eyes glowing just like the shadows. "Run," the figure whispered, its voice mocking. "There's nowhere to run." Ray realized with growing dread that it might be right. Ray and the robber stood frozen, surrounded by rising shadows and skeletal figures clawing their way out of the ground. The chilling whispers were now deafening, like an angry crowd surrounding them. Every grave seemed alive, and every shadow seemed to watch. The robber clutched Ray's arm tightly. "We can't stay here. They're going to kill us," he whispered, his voice trembling. Ray snapped out of his paralysis and shook the robber's grip. "We need to move. Follow me," he said, though his voice betrayed his own fear. He pointed his flashlight ahead, but the beam was dim, swallowed by the growing darkness. The two men ran, dodging tombstones and skeletal hands reaching from the ground. The fog grew thicker, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The path twisted and turned, and every time they thought they were getting closer to the fence, they found themselves back where they started. "It's like a maze," Ray muttered, his breath coming out in gasps. The shadowy figure appeared again in front of them, blocking their way. Its hollow eyes glowed brighter now, and its voice echoed like thunder. "You cannot leave. You belong to the graveyard now." The robber dropped to his knees, sobbing. "Please. I didn't mean to come here. I was just hiding." The figure stepped closer, its long fingers reaching out toward the robber. "You disturbed our rest," it hissed. Ray grabbed the robber by the arm and pulled him up. "Get up. We're not giving up," he shouted. But even as he spoke, the graves around them cracked open wider. The skeletal figures were fully out now, their hollow eyes glowing like the figures. "Run," Ray yelled. They sprinted again, but the graveyard felt endless. Every corner they turned looked the same, as if the graveyard itself was alive, trapping them inside. Ray stopped, his chest heaving. "We can't keep running. We need a plan." But before the robber could respond, the ground beneath them began to shake violently. A loud, ghostly scream echoed through the air. The night was far from over. Ray and the robber stumbled as the ground beneath them trembled, cracks forming like dark veins in the dirt. The ghostly scream echoed, louder and closer now, as if the graveyard itself was alive. The skeletal figures moved toward them, their hollow eyes glowing brighter, their bony hands outstretched. "We're trapped," the robber cried, his voice breaking. "No, we're not," Ray barked, though fear gripped his heart. "Keep moving." The two men ran through the twisting paths, dodging the grasping hands of the dead. The fog thickened, and the air felt like ice, cutting into their skin. Ray's flashlight flickered, threatening to die at any moment. Every direction seemed wrong, but they had no choice, they couldn't stop. The shadowy figure appeared again, its tall form blocking their path. It raised its bony hand, and the whispers around them turned into a deafening roar. "You will not leave," it declared, its hollow voice shaking the air. Ray reached for his holster and drew his gun. He aimed it at the figure, his hands trembling. "Stay back," he shouted. The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Your weapons mean nothing here." But Ray fired. The sound of the shot rang out, but the bullet passed through the figure as if it were smoke. The laughter grew louder. The skeletal figures closed in, their bony fingers brushing against Ray and the robber. Desperate, Ray grabbed a broken branch from the ground and swung it at the nearest skeleton. To his shock, the skeleton shattered into pieces. "They can be stopped," he shouted. The robber grabbed a rock and began smashing the other skeletal figures. Together, they fought their way toward the fence. The shadowy figure screamed in anger, its form flickering like a dying flame. At last, they reached the fence. Ray boosted the robber over first, then climbed up himself. As he jumped down to the other side, the ground beneath them stopped shaking. The screams and whispers faded into silence. Both men collapsed, gasping for air. They were free, or so they thought. In the distance, the faint glow of hollow eyes still watched them from the shadows. The nightmare wasn't over.